The character I chose from Somebody Else's Kids by Tori Hayden was Boo. I chose him because he reminded me the most of my own son. Some things I like to discuss about Boo was his delayed echolalia. That was him repeating phrases from the news and other things he had heard. That's a form of verbal stimming where they repeat things that they really, really like. And it kind of soothes them to repeat those things. I'd like to talk about his delayed language. Even though he was 8, he wasn't talking like a normal 8-year-old. That's normal for autistic kids. A lot of times what he talked about was not related to the things going on. That was a delayed echolalia. And that's what kind of made Boo, Boo. Along with those, there was the physical stimming. That's the flapping, the hiding, all those things where he keeps his hands on his side, the crawling under things. That's a physical stim. We're going to talk about his self-harm. The most specific part of that was the day that Claudia took him in to use the restroom, and he saw that Mylar, and it kind of overwhelmed him, and he started scratching himself and freaking out. And that's part of a meltdown. In autism, a lot of times they can't help it. They're not being bad kids. It's just something they can't help. They get so overwhelmed, they melt down. I'd like to talk about his loving mother. His mother loved him very much, and one of the biggest things in that book that impacted me is when his mom talks about how she didn't want him to go to one of those homes and be one of those like big old boy who was naked and crying and covered in pee. I, too, as a mother of an autistic child, have seen those documentaries. I've seen how terrible those children were treated. It brings tears to my eyes. To think that was even closer to her then. That was a real possibility that Boo could have ended up like that. But he was able to learn in an alternative fashion. Tori found ways he could learn and do things that may not have been the norm for the 80s classroom, but it did work for Boo. I think some other impairments Boo had was that he was multiracial. His mother was black and his father was white. And that was a big impediment back then. It wasn't the norm, and I think it got a lot of discrimination, only because he was disabled, but because he was multiracial. The N-word was used a lot, which is not something we use nowadays. But in the world of Tori Hayden, Somebody Else's Kids, yes, that was a thing he had to face. And that period was not accepting of disabled children, especially not multiracial disabled children. The other things I like to talk about was his issues toileting. He was still in training pants, which is common for children of that age. I think it's a sensory thing. It's hard to potty train an autistic child. I have 2 of them, and one was 9 and one was 5 before we got them potty trained. The undressing, I've seen this a lot in my students. I think it's part of a sensory issue. Sometimes it just feels better not to have clothes on. So they undress and they kind of run around. And that's something that we saw in Boo and that Boo did. And the last thing I'd like to talk about with Boo is his elopement. He would run out of the classroom. His very first day there, Tori had to go run out of the classroom and go find Boo. She didn't know where he was and had to find him underneath a table. He did that, I think, a few more times throughout the book, and that's another thing we see common in autistic children.